June 6th, 1944, dawned grey and violent over the beaches of Normandy, where Hauptsturmführer Friedrich Weber crouched behind a concrete bunker overlooking what the Germans called Omaha Beach. The Atlantic surf churned with landing craft, thousands of them, disgorging men who stumbled through chest-deep water toward obstacles his engineers had spent months preparing. Weber had fought in Poland, in France, during 1940, in the Balkans, and on the Eastern Front. He was a veteran of the Waffen-SS, part of what German propaganda called the most elite fighting force ever assembled, and as he watched American soldiers wade through a killing zone of machine gun fire and artillery, he felt something close to pity mixed with professional disdain. "They move like children." "Playing soldier," he reportedly told his platoon sergeant, according to accounts preserved in German military archives. "Look at them, bunched together. No discipline, no coordination. These are factory workers and farmhands in uniforms. They will die here, and this invasion will fail like Dieppe." Weber's assessment reflected a widespread belief among German forces in 1944. The Waffen-SS, in particular, considered themselves combat veterans of the highest order. They had conquered nations, defeated armies, and survived campaigns that had tested them against the toughest opponents Europe could field. The Americans, by contrast, were seen as untested recruits from a soft, democratic society that valued comfort over martial excellence. German intelligence reports from early 1944, documented in various military archives, consistently characterized American forces as poorly trained, badly led, and likely to break under sustained combat pressure. This perception had been carefully cultivated through years of propaganda and what seemed like supporting evidence. The Waffen-SS had observed American performance in North Africa and Italy with a critical eye. Yes, the Americans had resources, vast industrial capacity that could produce tanks and aircraft in staggering numbers, but individual combat effectiveness, tactical sophistication, the fighting spirit necessary to stand against elite German units, German officers remained deeply skeptical. They had seen American units struggle in Italy, where difficult terrain and determined German defenders had slowed the Allied advance to a crawl. They had read intelligence assessments describing American training as rushed and inadequate. They had intercepted communications revealing command failures and coordination problems. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Sturmbannführer Hans Dietrich, commanding an SS Panzer Grenadier battalion positioned near Carentan, had reviewed American order of battle information in late May 1944 and shared his conclusions with fellow officers at a tactical briefing. According to post-war interviews preserved in various historical collections, Dietrich stated that the Americans possessed quantity but lacked quality. Their soldiers were conscripts who wanted to survive rather than warriors who sought glory. Their officers were promoted through political connections rather than proven battlefield excellence. Their entire military culture emphasized comfort and safety over hardship and sacrifice. These views permeated the Waffen-SS units stationed in France during the spring of 1944. The soldiers considered themselves part of an unbroken warrior tradition stretching back through German military history. They had endured training that broke weaker men, fought in campaigns that had forged them into hardened combat veterans, and developed unit cohesion through shared sacrifice. The Americans, they believed, possessed none of these advantages. American soldiers were civilians in uniform, rushed through inadequate training, and sent to fight a war they didn't understand against opponents they couldn't match. The morning of D-Day seemed to confirm these assumptions. Weber watched American infantry get cut down by machine gun fire as they crossed open beaches. He saw men freeze in terror, saw others run in panic, saw the chaos of an assault that appeared to be collapsing under German defensive fire. The Americans were dying in large numbers, just as German planners had predicted. Entire landing craft were destroyed before reaching shore. Bodies floated in the surf. Wounded men crawled desperately toward any cover they could find. Yet something unexpected began to emerge as the day progressed. The Americans kept coming. Landing craft continued to arrive despite horrific casualties. Artillery fire from naval vessels offshore began to systematically destroy German defensive positions. Small groups of American soldiers found ways to advance despite overwhelming fire. By afternoon, American forces had established precarious toeholds on beaches that should have been killing grounds from which no attacker could escape. Weber found himself surprised by American persistence. These weren't elite troops using sophisticated tactics, but they possessed a stubborn refusal to accept defeat that didn't match German expectations of soft American civilians. When one approach failed, they tried another. When positions became untenable, they withdrew slightly and then returned with different tactics. They called in naval gunfire with increasing accuracy, used their overwhelming firepower to suppress German positions, and gradually expanded their beachheads through sheer determination, backed by material resources. Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann, commanding a defensive position at Utah Beach, reported to his superiors that evening about what he had witnessed. According to documents from German 7th Army records, Hoffmann noted that American troops displayed more tenacity than anticipated. While their tactics were often clumsy and their casualties heavy, they maintained pressure through continuous reinforcement and massive fire support. Hoffmann concluded that while individual American soldiers were not impressive, their system of warfare, emphasizing firepower and material superiority over tactical finesse, was proving difficult to counter. The German defenders had inflicted terrible casualties. Thousands of American soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing, but the Americans had achieved what German planners considered impossible. They had breached the Atlantic Wall, established beachheads on French soil, and were pouring reinforcements ashore despite German counterattacks. Within 48 hours of the initial landings, over 150,000 Allied troops were in France, and that number was growing by the hour. 4 Waffen-SS units positioned inland, waiting to counterattack and throw the invaders back into the sea. The situation presented both opportunity and growing concern. They possessed superior training, better individual soldiers, and combat experience that American forces lacked. But they also faced an enemy who possessed air superiority so complete that daylight movement became nearly suicidal, artillery support so massive that German positions could be obliterated in minutes, and logistical capacity that seemed unlimited. Obersturmbannführer Kurt Meyer, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, received orders to counterattack Allied positions near Caen on June 7th. Meyer was a decorated veteran who had fought across Europe and earned a reputation for aggressive, effective leadership. His division consisted of young soldiers, many just 18 or 19 years old, but trained to Waffen-SS standards and equipped with some of Germany's best tanks and weapons. Meyer approached the coming battle with confidence. His men were ready, their equipment was superior, their training was excellent, and they would be fighting Americans and Canadians who were still disorganized from the chaotic beach landings. The battle that developed over the following days shattered some of Meyer's assumptions while confirming others. His SS Panzer Grenadiers advanced with the tactical proficiency expected of elite German units, using terrain skillfully, coordinating infantry and armor effectively, and striking Allied positions with violence and precision. Initial attacks achieved local successes, pushing back Canadian and British forces in some sectors and inflicting heavy casualties. But when Meyer's units encountered American forces, something unexpected happened. Yes, the Americans were often tactically inferior. Yes, they made mistakes that German veterans wouldn't make. But they also demonstrated a willingness to call down massive artillery barrages on their own positions if it meant stopping German attacks. They had access to naval gunfire that could reach far inland, delivering shells of devastating size and accuracy. And they possessed a pragmatic approach to warfare that valued results over military aesthetics. German tanks were superior to American Shermans in almost every technical specification. German tank crews were more experienced. German tactics were more refined. Yet, American tankers operated in groups, using numerical superiority to overwhelm individual German tanks. When one Sherman was destroyed, 2 more took its place. When German positions proved too strong for frontal assault, Americans simply bypassed them and called in artillery or airstrikes to reduce them later. The Americans were fighting an industrial war, treating combat as a problem to be solved through the application of overwhelming resources rather than martial skill. Sturman Peter Richter, serving with Meyer's division, wrote in a letter home on June 11th about his first encounter with American forces. According to the letter, later preserved in family archives and referenced in historical studies, Richter described Americans as clumsy but dangerous. "They don't fight like soldiers," he wrote. "They fight like businessmen solving a problem. When we destroy their tanks, they bring more tanks. When we hold a position, they call airplanes to bomb us. They have no sense of honor in combat, only efficiency in killing." This observation captured a fundamental disconnect between German and American approaches to warfare. The Waffen-SS emphasized warrior ethos, individual courage, tactical brilliance, and fighting spirit. The Americans emphasized firepower, logistics, coordination, and achieving objectives through whatever means worked most efficiently. Neither approach was inherently superior in all circumstances, but in the campaign developing across Normandy, the American method was proving devastatingly effective. June 20th, 1944, found German forces compressed into defensive positions around Caen, a city that Allied planners had expected to capture on D-Day, but which still remained in German hands 2 weeks later. Waffen-SS units, fighting in the rubble-strewn streets and surrounding countryside, had demonstrated that in defensive combat, with proper positions and motivated soldiers, German forces could slow Allied advances to a grinding crawl. American and British units were paying in blood for every mile gained, yet the tactical successes couldn't obscure a strategic reality that was becoming increasingly apparent to thoughtful German officers. Time favored the Allies. Every day that passed brought more Allied troops, more equipment, more supplies into France. German reinforcements were limited by Allied air superiority that made daylight movement nearly impossible, and by strategic reserves being held to counter expected invasions elsewhere. The Allies could sustain casualties and continue attacking. Germans could inflict casualties but couldn't replace their own losses. Hauptsturmführer Weber, who had survived the initial invasion, found himself commanding a much-reduced company by late June. Casualties had been severe, not from single catastrophic battles, but from continuous attrition. Artillery fire claimed men every day. Air attacks destroyed vehicles and killed soldiers in their defensive positions. Patrols encountered American forces and suffered losses that couldn't be replaced. Weber's company, which had numbered over 150 men on June 6th, was down to fewer than 90 by June 20th. More troubling than the casualties was what Weber observed about American improvement. The same American units his men had engaged 2 weeks earlier were noticeably more effective. They moved more carefully, used cover better, coordinated their attacks with greater skill, and showed increasing confidence. The Americans were learning, rapidly adapting based on combat experience, and applying those lessons across their entire force. Weber had fought Soviet troops on the Eastern Front, who absorbed staggering casualties and kept attacking through sheer mass. He had fought British troops who advanced with methodical professionalism. But the Americans were different. They combined British organizational skill with a pragmatic willingness to try new approaches, backed by material resources that seemed inexhaustible. German intelligence officers were compiling reports that painted an increasingly concerning picture of American capabilities. Documents from this period, preserved in various military archives, show that German assessments of American forces were evolving rapidly. Initial reports, describing Americans as poorly trained and likely to break under pressure, were being replaced by more nuanced analyses. American soldiers, the revised assessments noted, demonstrated variable tactical skill but consistent determination. American artillery was extremely effective, capable of massing fire rapidly and accurately. American air support was overwhelming, making German movement nearly impossible during daylight. American logistics functioned flawlessly, ensuring frontline units never lacked ammunition, fuel, or supplies. The psychological impact of continuous Allied pressure was beginning to affect even elite Waffen-SS units. Soldiers who had endured brutal combat on the Eastern Front found the Normandy campaign uniquely exhausting. There was no respite from artillery fire, no safe area behind the lines, no ability to rest and refit without constant harassment. Allied aircraft patrolled constantly, attacking anything that moved. American patrols probed German positions day and night, preventing rest and forcing constant vigilance. Untersturmführer Anton Schulz, leading a platoon in an SS reconnaissance battalion, recorded in his diary on June 25th about the cumulative strain of fighting in Normandy. "We are veterans who have survived campaigns across Europe," he wrote. "Yet here we find ourselves worn down, not by superior soldiers, but by superior resources. The Americans are not better fighters than we are. But they have more of everything, more ammunition, more tanks, more aircraft, more food, more medical supplies, more replacements. We kill them, and more arrive. We destroy their equipment, and more appears. It is like trying to hold back the ocean with our bare hands." The battle for Normandy was revealing fundamental truths about modern warfare that German doctrine had not fully appreciated. In mobile campaigns across open terrain, German tactical superiority and operational skill had proven decisive, but in attritional fighting, where both sides held relatively static positions, material superiority became paramount, and in material superiority, the Americans possessed advantages that German forces simply could not overcome. July 1st, 1944 brought rain to Normandy, turning roads to mud and providing temporary relief from Allied air attacks. But it couldn't wash away the reality confronting German defenders. The Allies had expanded their beachheads significantly, linked them into a continuous front, and were preparing for breakout operations that would transform the campaign from static fighting into mobile warfare. German forces knew the breakout was coming. They could see American forces massing, could observe preparations for major offensives, could read the signs that experienced soldiers recognize. But they lacked the reserves, the mobility, and increasingly the morale to prevent it. Sturmbannführer Dietrich, whose battalion had been fighting continuously since June 7th, gathered his surviving officers on July 1st for a tactical assessment. According to post-war accounts from officers who attended the meeting, Dietrich spoke with unusual candor about their situation. "We have fought well," he reportedly said. "Our men have demonstrated courage and skill that would bring victory against any enemy we previously faced. But these Americans are not like previous enemies. They do not need to fight better than us. They simply need to sustain losses and keep coming, and they can do that indefinitely while we cannot." This assessment was spreading through German ranks, whispered in foxholes, and discussed in command posts. The Americans weren't supermen. They weren't tactical geniuses. Many American soldiers were still making basic mistakes that German veterans had learned to avoid years earlier. But the Americans possessed something potentially more valuable than individual excellence. They possessed a system of warfare that could absorb failures, learn from mistakes, and continue operating regardless of casualties, as long as the logistical tail kept supplying the fighting edge with everything needed to continue combat operations. The German defenders were also beginning to notice qualitative improvements in American performance that went beyond simple experience. American infantry tactics were becoming more sophisticated, showing influence from German methods. American use of combined arms, coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support was approaching German standards of proficiency. American junior officers were displaying increasing competence and initiative. The transformation wasn't complete. American forces still had weaknesses that German units could exploit. But the trajectory was clear. The Americans were getting better, and they were getting better faster than German forces could adapt. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Brandt, serving in an SS machine gun section, experienced this evolution firsthand. In early June, his section had repeatedly repulsed American infantry attacks by firing into formations that advanced too close together and exposed themselves unnecessarily. By early July, American infantry approaching his positions moved in dispersed groups, used smoke for concealment, and coordinated their attacks with artillery that forced Brandt's crew to take cover at critical moments. The Americans weren't suddenly brilliant tacticians, but they had learned basic lessons that made them significantly more effective, and they had learned those lessons in just 4 weeks of combat. The education went both ways. American forces were learning from German defenders, studying their tactics and incorporating effective techniques into their own operations. Captured German documents were translated and analyzed within days. Prisoners were interrogated extensively about German methods and equipment. Every engagement generated after-action reports that circulated throughout American units, spreading lessons rapidly across the entire force. The Americans had created a military learning system that operated at a scale and speed German forces couldn't match. German military tradition valued excellence, developed through long training and rigid adherence to proven doctrine. The American military valued effectiveness, achieved through rapid adaptation and willingness to discard approaches that didn't work. In the static environment of Normandy fighting, where both forces learned from continuous engagement, the American approach was proving more effective. German units fought with consistent tactical skill, but limited ability to evolve beyond their training. American units fought with variable tactical skill, but remarkable capacity to improve through experience. July 10th, 1944, found Hauptsturmführer Weber studying captured American equipment that had been brought to his battalion headquarters for analysis. A destroyed Sherman tank sat in a field, its armor penetrated by an 88mm gun. Beside it lay American infantry weapons, rations, medical supplies, and personal equipment taken from casualties and prisoners. Weber walked slowly around the Sherman, examining it with the professional interest of a veteran tanker who had commanded panzers on the Eastern Front. The tank itself was technically inferior to German Panthers and Tigers in almost every measurable category. Thinner armor, less powerful main gun, higher profile that made it easier to spot and hit. German tank crews called Sherman's Ronsons after the cigarette lighter brand because they burned so readily when penetrated. Yet this inferior tank was winning the armored battle in France through sheer numbers. For every Panther Germany produced, America manufactured 5 Shermans. When German tanks destroyed American armor, replacements arrived within days. When American tanks destroyed German armor, those losses were permanent because no replacements existed. Weber examined the equipment scattered around the tank. American soldiers carried more ammunition than German infantry, with magazines and bandoliers that allowed sustained fire. Their rations were varied and calorie-dense, chocolate bars and canned goods that German soldiers surviving on reduced allotments could only dream about. Medical supplies included sulfur drugs and morphine in quantities that German medical services no longer possessed. Every detail spoke to an enemy whose industrial base could supply its military with everything needed to sustain continuous operations. The personal effects were equally telling. Letters from home showed that American soldiers received regular mail, maintaining connection with families across the Atlantic. Pay records indicated that American privates earned more than German officers. Photographs showed soldiers posing with abundant food, comfortable quarters, and recreational equipment. These weren't warriors, bred for hardship and sacrifice. These were civilians in uniform, expecting certain standards of care and supply, even in combat zones. Yet, somehow, this civilian army was defeating German forces that had conquered most of Europe. Obersturmbannführer Meyer, visiting Weber's battalion that afternoon, examined the captured equipment with particular interest in American tactical documents. Training manuals, operation orders, and after-action reports revealed an approach to warfare that emphasized systematic problem-solving over martial tradition. According to accounts preserved in post-war collections, Meyer noted that American military doctrine was less elegant than German methods, but potentially more practical for industrial-age warfare. The American approach to combined arms coordination particularly impressed German analysts. While German forces had pioneered combined arms tactics in the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 through 1941, they had done so through rigorous training and careful coordination that required skilled, experienced personnel. American forces were developing systems that allowed even inexperienced units to coordinate effectively. Radio networks connected infantry to artillery to air support with redundancy that ensured communication remained possible even under difficult conditions. Standardized procedures meant that units from different divisions could work together with minimal confusion. The emphasis was on creating reliable, repeatable processes, rather than relying on individual brilliance. German officers studying these American methods recognized that they were observing a different military philosophy. The Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS emphasized creating superior soldiers through demanding training and combat experience. The American military emphasized creating superior systems that could produce acceptable results even with average soldiers. Neither approach was absolutely superior. But in a total war where casualties constantly eroded the ranks of experienced personnel, the American system possessed significant advantages. July 20th, 1944, brought multiple crises to German forces in Normandy. In Germany itself, army officers attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler in what became known as the July 20th plot. The assassination failed, but the resulting purges and paranoia disrupted German command structures at the worst possible moment. In Normandy, American forces were preparing Operation Cobra, a massive breakout offensive that would transform the campaign from attritional fighting into mobile warfare, and Waffen-SS units that had held defensive positions for 6 weeks were approaching the breaking point from continuous combat and irreplaceable losses. Sturmbannführer Dietrich's battalion, which had numbered over 800 men on June 6th, was reduced to fewer than 300 effectives by late July. Every man was a combat veteran now, hardened by weeks of brutal fighting, but they were also exhausted, undersupplied, and increasingly aware that they were fighting a losing battle against an enemy who could sustain operations indefinitely. German soldiers joked grimly that the Americans must have factories that produced soldiers along with tanks and aircraft, because killing Americans never seemed to reduce their numbers for long. The material disparity was becoming absurd. American artillery could fire barrages that consumed more ammunition in an hour than German batteries received in a week. American infantry called in airstrikes on individual German positions, using precision that seemed wasteful, but reflected unlimited resources. American tanks advanced with such numerical superiority that German anti-tank guns could destroy multiple Shermans and still be overwhelmed. Every aspect of the battle demonstrated that German forces, no matter how skilled, were fighting an enemy who possessed material advantages that tactical excellence couldn't overcome. Lieutenant Hoffman, whose defensive position at Omaha Beach had been overrun in late June, was now serving with a regiment defending against American forces near St. Lo. He wrote in a letter to his family on July 21st about the transformation he had witnessed in American capabilities. According to the letter, preserved in family archives, Hoffman stated that the Americans arriving in France in June were uncertain, poorly coordinated, and clearly inexperienced. The Americans attacking in July were confident, well-coordinated, and demonstrating tactical competence that approached German standards. They still made mistakes, Hoffman noted, but they made fewer mistakes than they had 6 weeks earlier, and they learned from errors with remarkable speed. July 25th, 1944, exploded into history as Operation Cobra began with a massive aerial bombardment that dropped over 4,000 tons of bombs on German positions in a narrow sector near St. Lo. The bombardment was so intense that even American forces miles from the target area felt the ground shake. For German soldiers in the target zone, it was an experience beyond anything they had endured. Even veterans of the Eastern Front who had survived Soviet artillery barrages, Obergefreiter Brandt crouched in a dugout as the world disappeared in explosions. The bombing lasted for hours, wave after wave of aircraft dropping ordnance that obliterated defensive positions, destroyed equipment, and killed or wounded hundreds of German soldiers. When the bombing finally stopped, survivors emerged from dugouts and bunkers to find their defensive line essentially destroyed. Strong points that had taken weeks to construct were reduced to smoking craters, communications were severed, units were scattered, and before anyone could reorganize, American infantry and armor were already advancing through the devastated landscape. The American breakout from Normandy demonstrated what happened when overwhelming material superiority combined with improved tactical competence. German forces fought with their characteristic skill and determination, but they couldn't hold positions that had been pulverized by aerial bombardment. They couldn't maintain coherent defensive lines when American tanks poured through gaps in numbers that swamped remaining German positions. They couldn't stop American advances when every German counterattack was met with devastating artillery fire called in by forward observers who seemed to have unlimited ammunition available. Within 3 days of Operation Cobra's launch, American forces had broken through German defensive lines and were advancing into open country. The breakthrough transformed the campaign from static trench-style fighting into mobile warfare. And in mobile warfare, the Americans demonstrated that they had learned far more than just how to coordinate attacks. They had learned German principles of mobile operations, rapid exploitation of success, deep penetration to disrupt enemy rear areas, and aggressive pursuit of defeated forces. Hauptsturmführer Weber found himself leading his much-reduced company in retreat from positions they had held since June. Now, the experience was profoundly disorienting for soldiers who had spent their entire military careers advancing. German forces in Poland, France, the Balkans, and initially in the Soviet Union had been attackers, dictating the tempo of campaigns and forcing enemies to react. Now, they were the ones reacting, falling back, trying desperately to establish new defensive lines before American forces arrived. The American pursuit was relentless. Unlike earlier in the campaign, when American units sometimes paused to consolidate after limited advances, the forces breaking out from Normandy maintained constant pressure. They advanced through the night, something European armies rarely did. They bypassed strong German positions rather than becoming fixed in costly attacks. They used their mobility and logistics to maintain operational tempo that prevented German forces from establishing stable defensive lines. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. August 1st, 1944 found American armor racing across France faster than German forces could retreat. Units of the 3rd United States Army, commanded by General George Patton, were advancing at rates that exceeded even the German blitzkrieg of 1940. Patton's forces moved with aggressive confidence, treating the pursuit as an opportunity to destroy German forces rather than simply push them back. And Waffen-SS units that had once mocked American military capabilities were experiencing the profound shock of being outmaneuvered and outfought by an enemy they had considered inferior. Obersturmbannführer Meyer, attempting to organize defensive positions near Mortain, received reports that American forces were already behind his intended positions. The speed of American movement made conventional defensive planning nearly impossible. By the time German units established positions, American forces had already bypassed them and were threatening to encircle them. The Americans were using German tactics, rapid exploitation, and deep penetration, with better effect than German forces could manage because they possessed the fuel, the vehicles, and the logistics to sustain high-tempo operations. The encirclement developing around Falaise in mid-August demonstrated American operational competence that rivaled German capabilities from earlier campaigns. American forces, advancing from the south, linked up with British and Canadian forces, pushing from the north, trapping significant German forces in a pocket near the town of Falaise. German commanders attempted to organize breakout attacks using tactics that had succeeded in similar situations on the Eastern Front. But the Americans responded with coordinated artillery fire, air attacks, and armor counterattacks that sealed the pocket and systematically destroyed German forces attempting to escape. Sturmbannführer Dietrich, whose battalion was trapped in the Falaise pocket, led a desperate breakout attempt on the night of August 19th. According to his post-war account recorded by Allied interrogators, the breakout succeeded in getting some men through American lines, but at catastrophic cost. Of the 300 men remaining in his battalion, fewer than 70 escaped encirclement. The rest were killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment was abandoned. Unit cohesion disintegrated. The battalion that had been an elite fighting force in June was destroyed as a military organization by mid-August. The Falaise pocket closed on August 21, 1944, trapping approximately 50,000 German soldiers and destroying hundreds of tanks, vehicles, and artillery pieces. Allied aircraft and artillery turned the pocket into a killing ground where German forces suffered casualties that eliminated multiple divisions as effective fighting formations. More significantly, the destruction of German forces at Falaise opened the route to Paris and demonstrated that American forces had evolved from uncertain beginners in June to operationally competent forces capable of executing complex maneuvers in August. Hauptsturmführer Weber survived Falaise through a combination of skill and fortune, escaping with a small group of soldiers before the pocket fully closed. On August 23rd, as he and his survivors moved east, trying to reach German lines, Weber encountered American military police directing traffic at a crossroads. The Americans were managing logistics for advancing forces with the efficiency of civilian traffic controllers, ensuring that fuel trucks, ammunition convoys, and supply vehicles flowed smoothly toward frontline units. Weber and his group avoided the Americans and continued their retreat, but the image stayed with him. The Americans were treating warfare like industrial logistics, moving supplies with the same systematic efficiency that German industry had once possessed, but could no longer sustain. August 25th, 1944, brought American forces into Paris, liberating the French capital after 4 years of German occupation. For German soldiers who had participated in the victory parade through Paris in June 1940, the symbolism was devastating. The campaign that had begun with German forces mocking American military capabilities had ended with American forces liberating France in just 11 weeks of mobile warfare following the Normandy breakout. The speed of the collapse shocked even German commanders who had grown pessimistic about their prospects. From the breakout at the end of July through the liberation of Paris in late August, American forces had advanced over 200 miles, destroyed multiple German armies, and transformed the strategic situation in Western Europe. The campaign demonstrated that American forces, given adequate time to learn and adapt, could execute mobile operations with competence that matched or exceeded German capabilities while backed by material resources that made sustained operations possible. Obersturmführer Meyer, who escaped encirclement and made his way back to Germany, provided detailed debriefings to German intelligence officers about what he had witnessed. According to documents from these debriefings, preserved in various archives, Meyer stated that American forces in August bore little resemblance to the forces that had landed in June. They had learned German tactical methods, improved their coordination, and developed confidence that made them dangerous opponents. More significantly, they possessed logistical capabilities that allowed them to sustain operations at a tempo German forces could no longer match. Meyer concluded that underestimating American capacity to learn and adapt had been a critical error that contributed directly to the catastrophic German defeat in France. The human cost of the Normandy campaign and subsequent operations was staggering for both sides. American forces suffered approximately 124,000 casualties, including over 20,000 killed during the campaign from D-Day through the liberation of Paris. The losses were grievous, representing thousands of families who received telegrams informing them that sons, husbands, and fathers would not return. Yet, American replacement systems ensured that units remained at strength, fresh soldiers arriving to fill ranks depleted by combat. German casualties were even more severe and, critically, irreplaceable. Waffen-SS divisions that had entered the campaign at full strength were reduced to battalion-sized remnants. Over 200,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment losses included hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, and artillery pieces that German industry could not replace. More devastating than the material losses was the destruction of veteran units whose experience and training had made them effective fighting forces. The Waffen-SS divisions that survived withdrew to Germany as shadows of their former capabilities, lacking the manpower, equipment, and increasingly the morale that had once made them elite forces. September 1, 1944, found Weber crossing into Germany with the remnants of his company. They had fought from Normandy through France, conducting rearguard actions and desperate defensive battles as American forces pursued relentlessly. Of the 150 men who had served under Weber's command on D-Day, only 37 remained. The rest were casualties, the price paid for attempting to hold France against an enemy whose capabilities German forces had fundamentally misunderstood. As Weber led his survivors east, he reflected on the transformation he had witnessed. The Americans landing in Normandy had been uncertain, inexperienced troops making basic tactical errors that cost them dearly. The Americans, pursuing across France, were confident, competent forces executing operations with a proficiency that approached German standards. The evolution had occurred in just 11 weeks of continuous combat, a learning curve so steep that it defied German assumptions about how military forces developed capabilities. The reasons for American improvement were systemic rather than mysterious. American forces had entered combat with intensive training that prepared them for modern warfare's basic requirements. They had possessed overwhelming material superiority that allowed them to sustain operations regardless of casualties. They had created organizational learning systems that captured lessons from combat and disseminated them throughout their forces. They had emphasized practical effectiveness over military tradition, and they had been willing to adapt their tactics based on what worked rather than what doctrine prescribed. German forces had fought with tactical excellence and desperate courage, but they had been fighting an enemy whose systemic advantages made individual superiority increasingly irrelevant. In June, German tactical skill had offset American material advantages. By July, American tactical competence had improved to levels where their material superiority became decisive. By August, American operational capabilities allowed them to execute maneuvers that German forces could no longer counter effectively. The mockery that Waffen-SS soldiers had directed at American recruits in the spring of 1944 seemed infinitely distant by September. Those same American recruits had liberated France, destroyed German armies, and demonstrated that underestimating their capacity to learn and adapt had been a catastrophic error. The lesson was purchased at terrible cost by both sides, but the outcome was unambiguous. The Americans had proven that systematic preparation, overwhelming resources, and organizational learning could overcome initial inexperience and develop effective military forces faster than traditional European methods suggested was possible. Lieutenant Hoffman, captured during the fighting near Paris, found himself in an American prisoner of war camp in early September. He was treated correctly according to Geneva Convention requirements, given adequate food and medical care, and processed with bureaucratic efficiency that reflected American organizational capabilities. During interrogation, Hoffman was questioned by American intelligence officers about German tactics and capabilities. The Americans asked detailed, informed questions that demonstrated they understood German military doctrine thoroughly. They were learning from their prisoners, just as they learned from combat, extracting every possible advantage from their enemy. In conversations with fellow prisoners, Hoffman discussed the campaign and what had gone wrong. According to accounts preserved in various historical collections, Hoffman stated that German forces had fought as well as could be expected, given their circumstances. Individual German soldiers remained better trained and more experienced than individual American soldiers. German tactics were still more refined. German equipment, particularly tanks and machine guns, was technically superior. Yet, none of these advantages had prevented catastrophic defeat because the Americans possessed systemic strengths that overcame German tactical excellence. The Americans could afford to learn through combat because their industrial base could replace losses, and their training systems could produce adequate soldiers in vast numbers. They could sustain high-tempo operations because their logistics functioned flawlessly. They could execute complex maneuvers because their communications and coordination systems worked reliably. They could maintain morale despite casualties because replacement systems kept units at strength, and supply systems ensured that soldiers were adequately fed and equipped. German forces, in contrast, fought at the end of overstretched supply lines with irreplaceable losses and diminishing resources. Every tactical victory was negated by strategic realities. Every successful defensive action was ultimately futile because American forces could simply bypass strong points and maintain pressure elsewhere. The material disparity that German soldiers had observed in June became overwhelming by August, and no amount of courage or skill could compensate for the fundamental imbalance in resources and sustainability. October 1st, 1944, found American forces on the German border, having advanced from Normandy beaches to the approaches of the Third Reich in less than 4 months. The campaign that Waffen-SS soldiers had expected to stop at the beaches had carried American forces across France with a speed that exceeded even optimistic Allied projections. The 11 months from D-Day to German surrender in May 1945 would see continued hard fighting, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. American forces, learning and adapting throughout the campaign, had become a military machine that German forces could not defeat. The legacy of the Normandy campaign and the liberation of France extended far beyond the immediate tactical and operational results. It demonstrated that American military forces, despite lacking the martial traditions of European armies, could develop effective capabilities through systematic training, organizational learning, and material superiority. It showed that industrial capacity, often dismissed by military professionals as less important than soldier quality or tactical excellence, was decisive in modern warfare between industrialized nations. The Waffen-SS had entered the campaign believing that warrior ethos and combat experience would overcome American material advantages. They learned at catastrophic cost that modern warfare favored systems over individuals, resources over tradition, and adaptability over rigid excellence. The Americans hadn't needed to be better soldiers than German SS troops. They needed to be adequate soldiers backed by superior systems, and that combination proved unbeatable. German military analysts in the years following the war studied the Normandy campaign extensively to understand what had happened and why. Their conclusions, preserved in various historical studies and institutional analyses, consistently identified several factors that explained American success. First, American training, while shorter than German training, focused intensely on practical combat skills rather than ceremonial traditions. American soldiers arrived in France with fundamental competencies that allowed them to function effectively once they gained experience. Second, American logistics and supply systems operated with efficiency that German forces could not match. American soldiers fighting in Normandy never lacked ammunition, rarely went hungry, and had access to medical care that significantly improved survival rates. German soldiers, in contrast, fought with inadequate supplies and limited medical support. The material disparity affected morale and combat effectiveness in ways that compounded over time. Third, American organizational learning operated at speeds that German institutional structures couldn't replicate. Lessons from combat were captured, analyzed, and disseminated throughout American forces within days. Tactics that worked were adopted army-wide. Tactics that failed were modified or abandoned. German forces, operating within more rigid doctrinal frameworks, adapted more slowly and less comprehensively. Fourth, American willingness to accept casualties while maintaining offensive pressure created cumulative effects that German forces couldn't counter. German tactical victories that inflicted heavy American casualties didn't slow American operational tempo because replacements arrived continuously. German casualties, in contrast, were irreplaceable, creating a war of attrition that Germany could not win. Oberst Hans von Luck, a German panzer commander who fought against American forces in Normandy, reflected in his post-war memoirs about the campaign. According to his account, German forces fought skillfully and bravely, but were ultimately defeated by an enemy whose systemic advantages overcame German tactical excellence. Von Luck noted that American soldiers in individual encounters often seemed less capable than German troops, but American units, in aggregate, operated more effectively than German units because American organizational systems compensated for individual weaknesses while German systems amplified them. The psychological transformation of German attitudes toward American military capabilities was perhaps more significant than the tactical defeats. Waffen-SS soldiers who had begun the campaign mocking American recruits ended it with grudging respect, fear, or simple, exhausted acceptance that they faced a formidable enemy. The transformation occurred through direct experience of American combat effectiveness, American material superiority, and American determination to achieve objectives regardless of cost. Hauptsturmführer Weber, who survived the war and provided extensive interviews to historians in subsequent decades, spoke candidly about how wrong German initial assessments had been. According to these interviews, Weber stated that German forces had allowed ideology and propaganda to cloud their professional military judgment. They had assumed that democratic societies produced weak soldiers, that industrial cultures created soft men, and that American emphasis on comfort meant American unwillingness to endure hardship. All these assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. American soldiers, Weber acknowledged, were indeed products of democratic industrial society. But that society possessed strengths that aristocratic military cultures didn't appreciate. Democratic citizens fighting for causes they believed in demonstrated remarkable determination. Industrial workers, accustomed to solving practical problems, approached warfare pragmatically and effectively. Commercial cultures that valued efficiency created military organizations that optimized resources and minimized waste. The Americans weren't warrior poets fighting for glory and honor. They were citizen soldiers fighting to complete a job and return home. That prosaic motivation, combined with superior systems and overwhelming resources, made them more effective than German warriors seeking martial excellence. The lesson was humbling for German officers who had spent careers believing in the superiority of their military traditions. The broader strategic implications of American success in France extended beyond the immediate campaign. German military leaders, witnessing how quickly American forces had evolved from uncertain beginners to competent adversaries, drew pessimistic conclusions about Germany's long-term prospects. If Americans could learn so rapidly in France, they would only become more formidable in future campaigns. If American industrial capacity could support operations in France while simultaneously waging war in Italy and the Pacific, German industrial capacity was hopelessly outmatched. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who commanded German forces in Western Europe during portions of the Normandy campaign, stated in post-war interrogations that the Americans had demonstrated capabilities that made German victory impossible. According to these interrogations, preserved in various archives, von Rundstedt acknowledged that American forces possessed material resources that German forces could not overcome through tactical skill alone. He noted that American organizational efficiency, logistical capabilities, and learning capacity created an enemy that would only grow stronger with time. The human dimension of the campaign remained its most poignant aspect. Thousands of American soldiers who had been civilians in 1943 died in French fields in 1944, never seeing their homes again. Their sacrifice liberated France and demonstrated American commitment to defeating fascism. Thousands of German soldiers, including many young Waffen-SS troops who had been indoctrinated into believing they were warriors of a superior race, died defending positions that could not be held against an enemy whose capabilities they had fundamentally misunderstood. Families on both sides received telegrams, letters, and official notifications of deaths, injuries, and captures. American families mourned sons who had crossed the Atlantic to fight in a foreign war. German families mourned sons who had fought in a criminal regime's military forces and paid with their lives or freedom. The human cost of the campaign, measured in the tens of thousands, was the price paid for strategic decisions, tactical miscalculations, and fundamental misunderstandings about modern warfare's nature. November 11, 1944, found American forces bogged down in difficult fighting along the German border, facing winter weather and German defenses that had stiffened after the rapid advances through France. The campaign's character had changed from mobile warfare back to attritional fighting, but the strategic situation remained fundamentally favorable to Allied forces. American units controlled France, possessed overwhelming material superiority, and continued to improve their tactical capabilities through combat experience. For Waffen-SS survivors of the Normandy campaign, now fighting in Germany itself. The situation was desperate. They defended their homeland with the courage of men who had nothing left to lose, but they fought without illusions about the war's outcome. The Americans would continue advancing, continue learning, continue applying overwhelming resources until German resistance collapsed. The only question was how long Germany could sustain the fight and how many more soldiers would die before the inevitable surrender. The mockery that German soldiers had directed at American recruits in the spring of 1944 seemed infinitely distant by winter. Those recruits had become veterans who had liberated France in 11 months, from D-Day through the capture of Strasbourg in November. They had demonstrated that American military forces, despite initial inexperience, could develop into effective fighting organizations faster than traditional European military thinking suggested was possible. They had proven that systematic training, organizational learning, and material superiority could overcome initial tactical disadvantages. The lessons learned during the campaign influenced military thinking for decades afterward. American emphasis on practical training, organizational adaptability, and resource efficiency became models for military forces worldwide. The understanding that modern warfare favored systems over individuals, logistics over tactics, and adaptability over tradition shaped how nations prepared for future conflicts. The recognition that industrial capacity was fundamental to military effectiveness influenced strategic planning and force development. December 15, 1944 brought the German Ardennes offensive, a desperate attempt to split Allied forces and recapture Antwerp. The offensive initially achieved surprise and local successes, pushing back American units and creating a bulge in Allied lines that gave the battle its popular name. But the offensive ultimately demonstrated how completely the balance of power had shifted since June. American forces, despite being surprised and initially pushed back, recovered quickly, reorganized effectively, and counterattacked with overwhelming force. The Americans no longer panicked when German forces attacked with tactical skill and violence. They had learned through combat in Normandy and France how to respond to German methods. They called in massive artillery support, brought up reinforcements, and maintained coherent defensive positions, even under intense pressure. Within 2 weeks, the German offensive had been contained. Within a month, it had been reversed. The operation consumed Germany's last strategic reserves and achieved nothing except to hasten German defeat. Obergefreiter Brandt, who participated in the Ardennes offensive, noted in his diary that the Americans they faced in December 1944 bore no resemblance to the Americans they had fought in June. These were veterans who knew their trade, possessed confidence in their capabilities, and had access to resources that made German attacks futile. Brandt wrote that destroying American tanks or inflicting American casualties accomplished nothing because more tanks and more soldiers always arrived. The Americans treated warfare as an industrial process where inputs, trained soldiers, and equipment were converted to outputs, captured territory, through systematic application of resources. January 1, 1945, found American forces resuming their advance into Germany after containing the Ardennes offensive. The final months of the European war would see continued hard fighting as German forces defended their homeland with desperate courage. But the outcome was predetermined. American forces, along with their British, Canadian, and French allies from the West and Soviet forces from the East, possessed overwhelming superiority in manpower, equipment, and industrial capacity. German forces could delay defeat through skillful defensive fighting, but they could not prevent it. Hauptsturmführer Weber surrendered to American forces in April 1945 as organized German resistance collapsed. He spent several years in prisoner of war camps, was eventually released, and returned to civilian life in Germany. In interviews conducted decades later, Weber spoke with remarkable candor about the Normandy campaign and what it had revealed. According to these interviews, Weber stated that the greatest German error had been underestimating American capacity to learn and adapt. German forces had fought well throughout the campaign, but the Americans had fought well enough while possessing advantages in resources and systems that made German tactical excellence insufficient for victory. The Waffen-SS soldiers who mocked American recruits in the spring of 1944 had learned through bitter experience that mockery was no substitute for realistic assessment. The Americans had proven that systematic training, organizational learning, and material superiority could produce effective military forces in timeframes that traditional military thinking considered impossible. The liberation of France, in 11 months from D-Day through late autumn, demonstrated that the Americans possessed not just industrial might, but also the capability to develop military competence rapidly when committed to a cause. The legacy of this transformation extended far beyond the immediate campaign. It established American military forces as among the most capable in the world, not because individual American soldiers were superior warriors, but because American military systems optimized effectiveness through training, logistics, adaptability, and resources. It demonstrated that modern warfare rewarded systematic preparation and organizational efficiency more than martial traditions or warrior ethos, and it proved that underestimating an adversary based on initial impressions or ideological assumptions could lead to catastrophic strategic errors. May 8, 1945, brought German unconditional surrender, ending the European War. And since American forces had fought from Normandy beaches to central Germany in 11 months of continuous operations, they had evolved from uncertain recruits in June 1944 to veteran soldiers who had defeated one of history's most experienced military forces. The transformation demonstrated principles that remained relevant to military organizations facing rapid change and uncertain challenges. Effective military training focused on practical skills rather than ceremonial traditions prepared soldiers for actual combat conditions. Organizational systems that captured lessons from experience and disseminated them rapidly throughout forces created learning organizations that improved continuously, logistical capabilities that ensured frontline units had necessary supplies and equipment enabled sustained operations regardless of tactical setbacks. Material superiority, when combined with adequate tactical competence, overcame opponents who possessed tactical excellence but lacked resources. The Waffen-SS had learned these lessons at terrible cost. Their initial mockery of American military capabilities had been replaced by respect, fear, or simple acknowledgement that they had fundamentally misunderstood their enemy. The Americans hadn't needed to be superior warriors. They needed to be adequate soldiers supported by superior systems, and that combination had proven unbeatable. The German experience, fighting American forces in France, stood as an enduring reminder of the dangers of underestimating adversaries based on ideological preconceptions, initial impressions, or assumptions about military effectiveness. Lieutenant Hoffman, released from American captivity in 1947, returned to Germany and eventually provided extensive interviews about his wartime experiences. According to these accounts, Hoffman stated that the Normandy campaign had revealed fundamental truths about modern warfare that German military traditions had obscured. Individual soldier quality mattered, but organizational effectiveness mattered more. Tactical excellence was valuable, but logistical sustainability was essential. Warrior ethos was admirable, but systematic competence was decisive. The Americans had understood these truths and built military forces accordingly. German forces had believed in older verities and paid with defeat. The story of how Waffen-SS attitudes toward American forces evolved from mockery to respect serves as case study in military assessment failures and successful adaptation. It illustrates how quickly motivated organizations can learn when provided adequate resources and institutional support. It demonstrates how industrial capacity, often dismissed as less important than combat prowess, proves decisive in sustained warfare between modern nations, and it shows how systematic training and organizational learning can compensate for initial inexperience and create effective military forces in remarkably short timeframes. The German soldiers who laughed at American recruits in the spring of 1944 learned by the spring of 1945 that they had catastrophically misjudged their enemy. The Americans had arrived in France as inexperienced soldiers, making basic tactical errors. Within 11 months, they had liberated France, pushed into Germany, and demonstrated military capabilities that rivaled or exceeded German forces who had spent years developing expertise through combat. That transformation, achieved through systematic preparation, organizational learning, and overwhelming resources, stood as testament to what modern military organizations could accomplish when they emphasized practical effectiveness over martial tradition. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.